right, here to break down the latest on the campaign trail. My buddy over at the Associated Press, he covers everything democracy, politics, race. You can catch all of his articles over at the Associated Press. Matt Brown. Matt, good to see you again, my friend.
Great to be here, man.
Yeah, I was talking to you. We were talking about this off air about all of the things that you've been covering throughout, the political cycle, as long as we've known each other and you've been on the show before. So I want to dive into some of the things that you've been covering for the Associated Press, specifically around the campaign trail, because we got a debate coming up next week for people that maybe have been living under a rock that don't know about this. So what's the latest that you've been covering from the campaign trail? Like, what's been some of the focal points that you've been covering from both of these campaigns?
Right, Mike. Well, a lot of what I've been covering throughout my career has been questions of do people have access to the ballot? Do people have the ability to engage in our political process? Whereas a lot of this year, the things that I've been looking at is do people want to vote? And who are the coalitions who these two campaigns are pulling together to engage? And a lot of that does come down to questions of identity and race, where the campaigns are, for the first time seeing potential shifts in how people of color are voting in this election, whether it be because of, questions of masculinity and Black and Latino men potentially shifting right, for instance, or questions of Middle Eastern and North African voters or Muslim American voters deciding to maybe even sit the election out because of the war in Israel-Palestine. There's been a lot of questions over how race, how gender, and how identity are coming here. And we've been seeing, with, for instance, the Dobbs decision and abortion coming to the fore, a massive gender divide in terms of how men and women across races and communities are voting in this country. So a lot of what I've been doing this summer is trying to see both how the campaigns are situating themselves and their messages and the messages that they're trying to where they're placing themselves, who they're campaigning with, where they're going digitally and in the real world to engage. But then also the questions of are those messages landing? What do people actually want from their leaders in this environment? And that's been what, in the run up to this debate, I think is going to actually matter most, not just at the debate, but then thereafter, come election day.
One of the things as you were talking there, and I'm nodding along because, as you were breaking it down about how the different races are being covered, because everybody's kind of mixed into this election. If you think about it from a foreign policy perspective, like you mentioned with the war in Israel and Gaza, and so the voter blocks that are here, we saw it during the primaries and the uncommitted vote in a couple different states. And then you talked about Black and Latino men. You and I are both a part of those groups. We're going to get into that in a second because you wrote a great article about how Black men feel like this is their time to finally elect a Black woman, at least from voters that you talked to in Atlanta. But I did want to ask you first, the last 6-7 weeks, because you were at the DNC at the Democratic National Convention. So the shift since the debate back in June and President Biden being the candidate and an old white guy to now a woman of color, and now 7-8 weeks later, what has kind of like shocked you just from covering all this, the way Democrats have been able to pivot to somebody else, younger, of color, female, that is going to be at the top of the ticket? How, the campaign messages, like you said, are they landing? Like, what if you make of the last 7 weeks? If somebody woke up, if fell asleep on June 27th and they woke up today in American politics, what would you say to them about these last 7 or 8 weeks?
I gotta say, Mike, it's been a very striking and in some ways you're correct, very shocking experience of watching after a real year of real tumult and frustration and anxiety among Democrats and liberals in this country about whether they would be able to piece together a coalition to beat Donald Trump, whether they'd be able to get the voters who they need in a lot of places, who might be very discouraged with the administration, or just more bluntly don't believe that an 81-year-old man is able to deliver on all of the things that he's delivering on. Even if the administration is doing certain things they like, Joe Biden was not getting credit for that because he was considered to be not in charge. So I think that the last month has been very striking in just the absolute astronomical amount of energy that I've seen on the trail. The campaign rallies have been crazy all across this country and states that I've been to. Even just talking to voters who aren't going to these campaign rallies and who aren't engaged in that way, it's very clear that there has been, I mean, as everyone's been talking about, a vibe shift in terms of where folks really from all different backgrounds. It's quite evident. That is, I can't say entirely surprising to me because, and this crystallized for me when I was at the DNC, was that for Democrats within the base, the DNC was very striking to me as almost a catharsis in terms of voters feeling, I just needed to feel this way. Like the joy that Democrats continuously are talking about is really just the feeling of, wow, like I feel like I'm able to articulate what I want for my country, what I want, policies I want to advocate for, and to actually say that with my whole chest. And then for so many voters outside of the Democratic base who are just looking at this, I think that a lot of people are just feeling a catharsis that they don't, that there's an option that isn't a 70 or 80 something year old white man who was on the ticket in 2020. So a lot of voters at the moment are just feeling this incredible relief just by the presence of Harris. I don't know that that necessarily means that she's going to win, obviously, or that all of these voters who feel a sense of relief want to vote for her. But I do think that a lot of people were just very, very surprised and taken back by everything that's happened in the months since the debate, from the assassination attempt of Donald Trump to the RNC. A lot of people felt in this news deluge over this last month that, wow, there is change is possible. And that is something that I think that the Harris campaign is really trying to ride and transition into, not just re-energizing their base, but really trying to win over voters who really just wanted to hear and see something even vaguely positive with all the craziness that we've been experiencing.
So let's stay on that for a second, because you've written a couple different pieces about the campaigns. I want to get into what the Trump team has started to do a little bit more in the influencer space, and with going on a couple different shows like Lex Friedman. I know you wrote some articles, Aiden Ross as well, but I want to get to the Harris campaign first, because a lot's been made in the Twitter sphere, to quote Ice Cube in a movie Once Upon a Time, about the way Kamala Harris has done campaign events over these past couple weeks. You know, obviously she did stops in Detroit, in Pittsburgh on Labor Day with pro labor unions out there. She's done a lot in terms of like outdoor stadiums, you know, stadiums themselves, outdoor events, stadiums themselves. And now she's like really hitting the trail hard. Whereas former President Trump is doing something different. This week, he doesn't have any campaign events lined up when we're recording this. He's doing something Saturday in Wisconsin, and he's been doing these interviews. So I want to start with Harris first, because the biggest thing that I hear from people that are watching these campaign events are like, okay, but I want to get a little bit more into economic policy. How does is Bidenomics going to roll into this? What's different about her? What are you hearing from voters as they learn more about the vice president? Are you hearing that, hey, I didn't know who Kamala Harris was? Like, to remember 2019, her primary run didn't get off the ground that fast. So what are you hearing from voters? Do they need to learn more about her? And what is it specifically that they want to learn more about her?
Well, there's two things about that. One, I will say just on directly with voters, what I've been hearing from a lot of folks is, yeah, people don't know who Kamala Harris is in a lot of ways. She's someone who was in the background of the Biden administration in many ways, and who, as a figure, as we've seen over the last month, wasn't necessarily someone who fit into the, I guess, aesthetic or ethos that Biden was always necessarily promoting. And that's not to say anything about her or her talents or her persona, but it is to say that when your principal president is an 81-year-old man who is trying to prosecute the case for the soul of America and wants to be very seen as very statesmanlike and almost a throwback to a previous generation, it's very difficult for your woman of color, younger former prosecutor vice president to be able to really show what she was and what her aesthetic was in the 2019 campaign in the White House. So a lot of voters have basically said that I'm kind of confused on what she is. I'm confused on what she stands for. So in that way, but people, I would also note, they're confused or they don't know, but they're very open when I've gone out to talk to voters, is that they're very curious about her. And the reason why they're curious about her, I should say, and the Harris campaign is trying to rally on this, is because she's been garnering so much energy and so many rallies inside of the Democratic base. This is a very deliberate strategy. The Harris campaign feels that they are underdogs, which means that they want to show that they have momentum. They want to generate interest in their campaign. They want people to say, oh, well, like something must be going on over there if all these people are showing up for her, if all these people are so interested in her. But when people finally do try to pay attention to and try to hear her, what they're looking for is saying, well, how are you going to make my life better? How are you going to make something different for me from an economic perspective, from a social perspective, from making the world just a more stable place? Is this someone who we can trust with the nuclear weapons? I mean, these are basic questions that the American people have about Harris. And what she's started to do at the DNC and has increasingly done since Labor Day, as you said, is really try to lay out a very practical vision that is, both dovetailing with standard democratic messaging in terms of taxing the ultra wealthy, increasing safety standards for communities and the middle class all around the country, but then also somewhat deviating from Bidenomics in terms of how she's talking about it. I mean, an opportunity economy is very much what she is billing herself as. There's a lot of California progressivism in some of the things that she's been saying, but then also a focus on lowering the cost of living. So that's the message that she is trying to get out there. It's unclear to me yet, and this is going to be really interesting to look at this month, if that message is really connecting with people, if people are hearing that after they say, okay, well, I've seen the memes, I've seen the energy, I've seen the rallies. Is that message that they're starting to roll out really actually landing and connecting with people?
Let me pivot real quick though to the former president, because you wrote an article about how he's trying to appeal to younger conservative males, and in the article he credits Barron, who's 18 and entering Columbia University, funny enough, and he talks about how Barron kind of introduced him to some of these podcasters. And this week, the former president went on Lex Friedman's podcast, this MIT scientist who's very popular in the space. Obviously, he went on Aiden Ross's podcast, who, given my age, I have no idea who that is. And I found out through TikTok. But it just goes to show how everyone's getting their message out through different means. I mean, you and I are talking on a podcast right now that's going to be all over the place on YouTube and social. So can you tell us a little bit first, your article, what the Trump campaign is doing with this effort? And then back to your question of like connecting the dots. Is it working? Because he's getting out on all of these platforms, but is it actually working? Is it making a dent, or is it just riling up his base of voters?
Yeah, so first, when I first started noticing the strategy just a little bit earlier this year, when it was very clear that the Trump campaign, surrogates like Byron Donalds, Wesley Hunt, Tim Scott, Matt Gaetz, Don Jr. were just showing up in a lot of places that I felt increasingly were, how do I put this, completely unfamiliar to anyone who was over the age of 40. But if you've ever played Overwatch, or how to play Fortnite, or you have a Reddit that you're actively using, or you have TikTok downloaded on your phone. Like these are spaces where a guy in his 20s, or a teenager even, would be far more familiar with who these men are. And I was just like, why is like this part of YouTube suddenly guiding where the Trump surrogates are going and whatnot? And it turned out that it really is a part of Trump's strategy here, where they view a lot of the election and a lot of the space where the 2020 election was fought on, essentially, in terms of, suburban voters, turnout for the both sides of the traditional basis. So let's say evangelical, white evangelical Christians for the Republican Party, and educated liberals and people of color for the Democrats. That's really where the election was fought in terms of turnout in 2020, and in terms of persuasion, it was really fought for these centrist, middle of the road suburbanites. That's not where the Trump campaign sees this election being litigated in 2024. They see it as a lot of those people who were fought in 2024 are mostly baked in, or at least those traditional demographics, whereas people who are, generally speaking, secular, maybe a little bit younger, often men, are actually the type of person who, in this new political environment that's often very, very digital, those are the people who might actually be persuaded on, questions post-COVID, on issues of, entrepreneurship in the economy, on questions of, frankly, just getting your message out to spaces that isn't in the traditional media, or isn't in, the usual information environment. So the Trump campaign has basically said, how do we go after the New York Times called it the bro vote. I called it, just like younger, temperamentally conservative, men, but men who aren't necessarily reading, traditional media, but are getting their information from, this just huge constellation of podcasts, YouTube channels, and then obviously, as I highlighted in my piece, Twitch and Kick streamers, people who, and I should stress, like, a lot of these guys, and it is mostly guys, are not making content that is necessarily political, but it is a space where, politics can come into play. And the Trump campaign sees that and has decided that this is a way that they can reach a lot of men who they believe will be able to be not just persuadable, but also would actually turn out in a way that, when folks were talking in 2016 that Trump really pulled a lot of working class white voters into the coalition unexpectedly, and even including people who didn't vote usually before. They're really hoping to do that again with some of these men under the age of 40, where they say a lot of, Black and Latino men in this coalition, a lot of men who are not necessarily always plugged into the news cycle. That's who they're really targeting. And I mean, Matt Gaetz put it really bluntly earlier this year, where he said, I believe he said, for every single Karen that we lose, we will win a Julio and a Jamal, which is genuinely speaking the strategy that Republicans have been going for. I think that it is obviously yet to be seen if this is an effective strategy. It is unclear if, when going after low propensity voters, if just because you have entertained them or engaged them or shown up in a space where they are, that necessarily translates into votes. But I mean, it would be step one of any process of this, is to actually show up and try to talk to people in the spaces and in the language that they speak. But is the election going to hinge on this? That is unclear. I think that what is clear is that Trump feels comfortable adopting this strategy in lieu of the many rallies that he should be doing, or needs to be doing, traditionally speaking, in lieu of the large voter engagement and door knocking grassroots campaigns that campaigns have traditionally been doing. His campaign's been eschewing a lot of that in favor of celebrity endorsements, in favor of going to alternative media environments, in favor of getting their strategy out in the digital space and in traditional media, by basically just having as much bombast and energy as possible in a very Trumpy way. That is how the campaign in many ways is structured itself, and we'll see if that's actually going to be effective come November.
I got to be honest, as you were saying all that, and I work day job wise in the boxing space. So, and I've worked with the Paul family. So I know he did Logan Paul's podcast. And so a lot of the people that I talk to in the boxing space, and sports and politics are perfect analogies for each other sometimes. But you see a lot of the same things, but a lot of those voters in that boxing world are finding former President Trump through these alternative sources, let's call them, for lack of a better phrase. I wanted to ask you just one more thing on that, because I know, and I've been asked this on TV hits about former President Trump going to NABJ. I was texting with a mutual friend of ours when it was all going down, who was in the room, and we were both kind of laughing because I don't understand why A, they would book him, B, why he would go. But it's back to what you were saying. Hey, you might as well throw a Hail Mary here and try to do different outreach and stuff like that. I'm not sure. I think you were there at NABJ, right? Yeah. Okay. So let me I don't need you to take me through the entire, an interview, 32 minutes. It got cut short. He blamed the microphones and then that Rachel Scott wasn't set up. I don't want to get into all of that. You can if you want. But I do want to get back into what you were saying of going to places where he may not feel comfortable or it doesn't make sense. I mean, he did a rally in the South Bronx at Crotona Park, where I grew up, Matt, like in the park where I grew up, where my cousins were like, what is he doing there? And I'm like, I have no idea what he's doing there. I don't know anybody in the South Bronx that's a Donald Trump supporter, nobody. So it makes sense when you've outlined it there. But what did you make of him going to talk to journalists that he's always said it's fake news. Everybody's fake news. He started off by saying Rachel Scott was fake news and ABC News and George, and I'm not going to give you the nickname of Stephanopoulos, but what do you make of him going and doing these extra things? Because is it really going to make a dent? Like that specific example of NABJ, what was gained from the campaign there when you talk to folks afterwards? Like what could they have possibly gained from that?
Yeah, so I think there's kind of two things going on here. So one, I would put the Bronx rally more into the category that his campaign was telling me earlier this year, that they wanted to rent out Madison Square Garden and they wanted to have a whole bunch of, NFL players and hip hop stars and NBA players and black pastors and leaders and whatnot, partying up there with him and showing that he's really got especially black men, like a lot of the black community, on his side. That has yet to materialize. And we only saw Amber Rose at the RNC. But, for instance, he just had, some huge heavy hitter reggaeton stars endorse him at his most recent rally. He had some popular TikTok rappers appear with him in the Bronx rally. So that's the strategy where they're basically trying to say that we will go and find whoever we can inside of communities of color and show that even in Chicago, even in New York City, even in Miami, we'll be able to, make inroads with these communities. That's not entirely the same thing with what was going on with NABJ, in my opinion, which is that is them a lot of that was them basically saying, well, we can go anywhere. Not that we're pulling something out of this community and showcasing to you that, well, even in Milwaukee or even in Detroit or even in Atlanta, we have people who are going to support us, but that I can go in front of NABJ, and which is the organization for Black journalists in America. It was founded to advocate for and represent the and represent journalists like me in this industry. I think that the strategy when speaking with folks in his orbit was very clearly that Trump should be able to show that like he's not scared of going to places like this, whereas Biden is hiding in a bunker or something. That was the idea. Did Trump fulfill that, given that so much of that event ended up devolving into debates over Kamala Harris's identity and him really lambasting Rachel Scott and even getting in arguments with Harris Faulkner and Kadia Goba during that interview, which I was in the room for. And just as a side note, one thing that I don't think a lot of folks appreciated is that at least a third to a half of that room was definitely college students who were affiliated with NABJ. And like that, those were the people who were willing to stand in line for 2 hours at 8 in the morning to go and see Donald Trump be interviewed at NABJ. And there's a whole other story about how NABJ processed this and whatnot. But what the Trump campaign was doing there was very much wanting to engage an audience that they didn't necessarily think was, going to be the most open, but not necessarily leave with a headline that said that Trump was attacking Harris's race in such a direct way. And I did a story the following day where we really reported people both inside the campaign, senior advisors outside of the campaign, and even lawmakers who were basically saying like, this is exactly not what you should have done. Like I'm totally open to you having gone to NABJ, but to do that, like that is the exact wrong headline that should have been coming out of this. So the question there with NABJ is with all of the top very very intense GOP strategists who are around Trump and the people who have this very like high-minded strategy of how they're going to create a working class coalition of men of color and conservative Christians and mostly white women who are concerned about issues that like Moms for Liberty champion. If that's the strategy, is Donald Trump the candidate who can actually thread that needle? They have the strategy, they have the candidate, and they know what the candidate is good at. The question is, can the candidate execute the strategy? And that is the question that these next 2 months is going to bear out.
Yeah, I mean that's what we're gonna see. I mean, it doesn't look like he can carry it out because he just gets wandered on this tangent, like you saw, and now the headline becomes he's attacking Rachel Scott, he's attacking Kamala Harris's identity, her name, everything in between. I want to ask you, let's pivot from Black journalists to Black men, okay? Because the two of us right here, we can each go into our own voter groups and people that make up those groups and their policy positions. But you wrote an article that Nick and I have been talking about on the show in terms of Black men, and it's really around this core issue of Black men supporting Black women. And you wrote this article talking about this group that really feels like it's their time to make an imprint on the 2024 election by supporting Kamala Harris. So I'm curious for you first, take people inside this article and this group that's in Atlanta, because obviously we know Georgia, we know the margin of victory from Trump's phone call, right, to Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger. So we know that it's such a thin margin. And we know that if you turn out the bluest of blue dots in Fulton County, et cetera, you could potentially win Georgia again. And Kamala Harris has done obviously some campaign stops there recently. So take us inside this article and this group and their aims. And then at a larger level, just Black men in general. The Trump campaign feels like they're making inroads with African Americans. I know they're making inroads with Latinos, and I can explain that in another episode, but explain to me, are they making inroads? Is it, back to your overarching point, is that message landing?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, I should just say that the event that I went to, which was hosted by the Black Man Lab in Atlanta, in the immediate aftermath of Biden stepping down and Kamala Harris being endorsed, was both a political event in that the event was discussing politics, but this is a weekly event that happens at a local YMCA in Atlanta, where men from across, Atlanta's southern suburbs and Atlanta proper itself really come together to discuss the experiences, challenges, and triumphs of Black men. So it really is a very important space, just not from a political perspective, but just from a community of really uplifting and centering Black men in a moment where the question is, how do Black men navigate this world that so often is not made for them, or is actively a challenge for so many Black men in this country. And that was a very interesting and I think important space to ask this question of Black men supporting Black women, Black men supporting Kamala Harris specifically, because it wasn't from a place of the vote being necessarily taken for granted. It was from a place of centering the humanity of Black men and what Black men truly want and need. So in that article, and then in speaking with advocates and organizers who have been who've been deeply energized and see this as a huge opportunity for Black men, I was very privileged to be able to hear the thoughts of a lot of Black men who basically said, listen, I feel so politically homeless oftentimes when it comes to these questions of what these politicians are going to do for us at a very, very high level. And that the opportunity that Harris is presenting, if she really follows through on it, that organizations like Win with Black Men and others are really pushing her to do, is that this can be an opportunity for Black men to finally have an unadulterated outlet in politics at a very high level. And I don't mean to take away from the fact we literally had a Black man president. Joe Biden is surrounded by Morehouse men. He will joke about that all the time, and many other Black men. But this was a moment where, because Kamala Harris knows, and the Democratic Party knows, that to win a state like Georgia, you need to energize the Democratic base, the traditional Democratic base, as much as possible. And so much of a base in a state that is very Black, like Georgia, is Black men. It is in her deep interest, if she wants to win states like Georgia, like North Carolina, and frankly, like the Midwestern states of like Michigan and Wisconsin, she's going to need to re-energize Black men and help them see an opportunity in her, because, the interests have changed over time. One thing that I talked about a lot in my article is that for so long, Black men have been seen as only wanting to do things on criminal justice reform, or, like Black voters in general, only really caring about voting rights, for instance. And those have been the overriding priorities of Black voters for decades, with clear reasons for why. But in this environment where we have had such high visibility of Black lawmakers in this country, where politics has really turned on questions of race and identity, a lot of Black voters, especially this younger generation who don't have direct memories of the civil rights movement, but do have memories of Ferguson, do have memories of George Floyd, are both, in a progressive sense, hoping for far more than I think what some of, I can even just say my elders have advocated for in decades past, but then in a more moderate or even conservative sense, wanting to realize an identity that goes beyond just some of these traditional quote unquote Black issues, and saying, I want to be an entrepreneur, I want to be a free man, I want anti-discrimination policies in the workplace, I want to be able to have the opportunity to be my whole self as a man in America. And I don't want the criminal justice system or corrupt corporations or whatever other institution that I believe is set against me to stop me in doing that. And that is driving so much of both what the Win with Black Men and other Democratic or left-leaning groups that are doing to try and win Black men, but then also when the Trump campaign looks at Black men at the moment and says, oh, you are deeply frustrated, you do not feel like you have been seen, I want to play on that. I want to play on that frustration. I want to show that there's another opportunity here. And maybe that means you don't vote, or maybe it means that you come into our fold. This is why Congressman Byron Donalds and others have been going out and really trying to court Black men, because they see you have, that like Trump's vision of a, deeply divided, almost tribalistic view of the nation might be able to appeal to men who just say, I just want to be me. Why can no one let me be me? And Trump will say, well, I'll let you be you. And that's basically the message. The question is, does Kamala Harris have a countervailing message? And the Democrats believe that they have a very, very strong one. And you have been seeing a lot more energy. I mean, the DNC was just absolutely filled with Black lawmakers basically saying that this is their number one priority of both combating direct sexism against Kamala Harris, but then also combating what they believe is misinformation about her record as a prosecutor. And then even going further, just the fact that that some people might not necessarily hear, as we talked about at the beginning of the conversation, a vision or a message that she might have. That's, I think, the really important thing. The Democrats are now trying to push out there that Black men, we see you, and that we have a policy agenda that will appeal to obviously not only Black men, but really all Americans, but specifically that this is going to address the key concerns that a lot of Black men have.
I did want to pivot on this last point here, and it's really around, as we're recording this, the debate's happening in a few days on ABC News. When this comes out, I think it's a few days before the debate. So this is going to be the first chance. Obviously, I don't know how many people watched the Kamala Harris and Governor Walz interview on CNN, or how many people truly watched that from a traditional media standpoint. But this debate, I feel like we got 51 million people watched the debate in June. What are you expecting from this debate? There's been reports of the Harris campaign is kind of preparing for her to just stay calm, let Trump do his Trump stuff. That's what worked in 2020 for Biden. And, you know, he kind of steamrolled not only Chris Wallace, but like you said, it was lost in the sauce because the story became how Trump and Chris Wallace were arguing. And the story was not Biden's policy positions or even Trump's. It was really that took place. So what are you expecting for this first debate? I read something that they've never met each other in person. I think she got asked that as well in the interview, that they have never met each other. What are you expecting for this first debate on ABC News and the topics that are going to be discussed?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that both Harris and Trump are going to be looking for the same thing, which is a very bombastic Trump soundbite. I think that Harris does not want to be seen in this moment when she's trying to introduce herself, as we've said to the American people. A lot of what she's been trying to do is show that she can be commander in chief and show that she can do the job. And, you know, implicitly, there's the question of being a biracial woman of color in that, and that we've never had that before in the Oval Office, which means that it is difficult for a lot of Americans to imagine that. And in that, any opportunity that she has in front of millions and millions of Americans to show that she is, you know, tough and determined and has this aura that is quote unquote presidential, she is going to be leaning in that. And that's where her campaign has really been trying to, you know, prep her in. At the same time, Donald Trump wants her to fall apart. He absolutely wants to make her look weak and incompetent and flummoxed and get, you know, unable to answer, you know, basic questions and whatnot. So he's going to be trying to hit her on a lot of different things here, and really seeing, it's going to just be interesting to see which way he goes. I mean, Trump is, after 9 years of him in political life and obviously decades and decades of him in public life, he's anything but predictable. So I will make no prediction on what he's going to say. I will say that he is definitely the one in this who is looking to, you know, basically halt her momentum here. The last time that he successfully did that with a Democratic candidate, it obviously has then resulted in him leaving the race. So I think that that's going to be haunting the Trump campaign a little bit in terms of just like, well, what do we need from his performance here? But in terms of the questions that are going to be asked, in terms of the top issues for them, I think that David Muir and Lindsay Davis are, you know, very, very straightforward, sober-minded journalists. I'm not going to say anything about any of the folks in our industry. I do think that it's going to be interesting to see how questions like immigration, like abortion, like Harris's record of, you know, adopting certain positions in 2020 and then not necessarily having them in 2024, obviously Trump and his legal situations, and also his just general endorsement and then backing away from questions, for instance, on abortion. I think that these are going to be some questions that are going to be top of mind to basically say, like, well, where do you guys stand on these issues, and how are you actually going to help the American people? I mean, just like one thing, for instance, with the NABJ interview, one moment that I thought was overlooked with the NABJ interview is when Harris Faulkner asked Trump, "What is your policy to lower costs and to reduce inflation?" And Trump immediately pivoted to attacking Harris, and Harris Faulkner said, "That's incredible. Thank you so much. What is the plan?" And then he pivoted to potentially lowering gas prices. So there's going to be certain questions like that I am anticipating, you know, really pinning people down on policy and trying to get away from, you know, everyone feels good about the vibes right now on both sides of the aisle, their respective vibes. But I do think the American people, especially the swing voters who matter, are yearning for people to say, "What will you actually do for my life?" And both campaigns would be, you know, very, very, you know, well served by actually addressing that in a way that doesn't make them look like they got egg on their face.
Matt, as I told a friend of mine who I'm not going to say his name, but I know he listens to the show. When he texted me as I was doing a TV hit about what to expect in night 3 of the DNC, he goes, policy? And I go, I must have missed all the policies when Hulk Hogan and Kid Rock were, it's a convention. Like, some of this, there's a performative element in this, but I think you're right. We do need to emphasize how do we get certain issues from a policy perspective executed, right? Credit card debt is a huge thing. The former president got asked about that, couldn't give a clear, concise answer. Hopefully, the moderators of this debate kind of steer the conversation into a true policy discussion of how these things are executed, because I think there are millions of folks out there that are truly still trying to learn more about at least Kamala Harris and are trying to figure out as early ballots, get sent out, who they're going to be voting for. You can check out all of Matt's work over at apnews.com, race and politics, democracy. He covers it all. Matt, I can't thank you enough for hopping on the program. Continued success to you, my friend. Please stay safe.
Thank you, man.